$9 for a tool made of real steel, heavy in the hand, built to actually work. Not a toy. Not clearance junk being dumped. Meanwhile, across the street, a nearly identical product is selling for $90. And the question arises naturally, without any advertising pushing it. Where did the price difference go? Harbor Freight doesn't create miracles, and they're not a charity either. What they've built is a cold but extremely effective business strategy. A strategy designed specifically for an America that is getting poorer, where the middle class can no longer afford to pay for lifetime quality, and workers are forced to choose the cheapest possible option just to keep doing their jobs. But cheap is never free. Behind every $9 tool are things that have been cut, loosened, or sacrificed. This video will strip that strategy bare and show you which items are real bargains, and which ones are traps you should never step into. Harbor Freight didn't arrive as a giant. In 1977, it was born in silence. 3 years later, the first store opened. No flashy lights, no inspirational slogans, just steel, plastic, and prices that made people stop and take a second look. For decades, Harbor Freight quietly grew along the edges of America. And then, when everything started getting more expensive, rent, gas, insurance, food, they accelerated. In 2013, the chain hit 500 stores. 6 years later, that number doubled to 1,000. By 2024, Harbor Freight had passed 1,500 locations with no sign of slowing down, heading straight toward 1,600. This was not random growth. This was calculated expansion inside a cracking economy. Annual revenue is estimated between $6 and $8 billion, a figure large enough to stand alongside many Fortune 500 names. But unlike them, Harbor Freight doesn't live on technological innovation or luxury branding. They live on a harsh truth. The more Americans are forced to tighten their belts, the more customers they gain. At the center of this empire is Eric Schmidt, not the man who created Harbor Freight, but the one who optimized it to a cold precision. His personal net worth is estimated at around $6.5 billion. While his customers count every dollar to buy a grinder, the system above runs smoothly, efficiently, and almost invisibly. Harbor Freight doesn't need a glamorous storefront. They choose areas Walmart has abandoned, towns where manufacturing has collapsed, places where people still need tools but can no longer afford the big names. Every store is a reminder that when living standards fall, the right business model rises. To survive and expand, Harbor Freight had to win on another battlefield, one consumers never step into: the factory. The real question isn't why Harbor Freight shows up where Walmart leaves, but how they can sell tools at prices the major brands can't match, even if they wanted to. The first truth that makes many people uncomfortable is this: Harbor Freight doesn't manufacture most of what they sell, but that doesn't make them inferior or amateur. On the contrary, they're playing on the same field as the biggest brands in America. Most Harbor Freight products are made in OEM factories across Asia, and ironically, those same factories are also producing for Ryobi, Milwaukee, Chicago Pneumatic, even Snap-on. Same assembly lines, same workers, same molds. The difference isn't where they're made, it's in the decisions. Harbor Freight buys directly from the factory, cutting out layer after layer of middlemen, paying nothing for $100 million marketing campaigns, and avoiding brand images built on professional pride. They apply private labels, load containers, and ship straight to their warehouses. Every step removed is a layer of cost that disappears. And that's how a $90 tool becomes a $9 one, without any magic. But this is the part the big brands don't want you talking about. When placing orders, Harbor Freight doesn't demand the same material standards. Steel may be steel, but the grade is different. A metal component competitors are willing to spend $7 on in raw materials, Harbor Freight spends $3. Lighter, softer, good enough but not excessive. There's no safety margin for major errors because that safety margin costs money. And then comes the most important part: quality control, or QC. For premium brands, defects are the enemy. A 1% failure rate can be considered a disaster. For Harbor Freight, defects are an accepted variable. Loosening QC standards means fewer products rejected, less waste, and significantly lower cost per unit. They aren't chasing perfection. They're chasing an acceptable ratio. If 1 out of 10 items fails, they don't panic. They calculated that. The warranty strategy is the armor that protects this model. Part of what you pay isn't in the product itself, but in the ability to return it. When something breaks, you bring it back. No arguments, no questions. Harbor Freight already budgeted for that cost. For them, replacing a few failed items is far cheaper than raising QC standards across the entire system. This explains why some Harbor Freight products surprise users with their durability, and also why others die after just a few uses. That isn't inconsistency. That's design. Harbor Freight doesn't sell the promise that a tool will last forever. They sell a probability that's good enough to get today's job done. For the weekend DIYer, that probability is more than enough. For professionals, it's a gamble. And when you step into a Harbor Freight store, you feel like you're free to choose. Long aisles, clear prices, everything within reach. But that's only the surface. In reality, your decision has already been guided, quietly and deliberately. Harbor Freight doesn't just sell tools. They sell a decision-making path. At the bottom is good. Warrior Basic Pittsburgh. Items so cheap they seem almost unreal. They exist to answer one question only. Can I buy this for the least amount of money possible? The answer is yes, but good is rarely what Harbor Freight actually wants you to walk out with. In the middle is better. Bauer, Quinn. Products with nicer specs, a more solid feel in the hand, and prices just high enough to make you tell yourself, I'm not stupid enough to buy the cheapest thing. This is the primary hunting ground. Not too cheap to raise suspicion. Not too expensive to require hesitation. Just reasonable enough to make you feel like a smart consumer. And then there's Best. Hercules. Icon. Names designed to break assumptions. Performance that nearly touches the major brands at prices that feel uncomfortably low. They aren't the top sellers, but they do something far more important. They make everything below them look like a reasonable compromise. This is the decoy effect in its perfect form. The premium line doesn't exist to replace Milwaukee or Snap-on. It only needs to sit there, long enough for your brain to compare, and conclude on its own that the better line is the balanced, safe, and intelligent choice. Harbor Freight reinforces this effect with an old weapon that never goes out of style: coupons. Coupons aren't just about saving money. They break your original plan. You walk in to buy 1 item, you walk out with 7. Because every item is cheaper than usual, and the human brain isn't wired to refuse consecutive bargains. Finally, there's the price comparison game. A $29 Hercules drill placed next to a $99 Milwaukee. No salesperson needed. No persuasion required. The brain does the rest. In that moment, Harbor Freight doesn't need to prove they're good. They only need to prove everyone else is expensive. The good, better, best matrix doesn't force you to buy. It makes you willingly choose exactly what Harbor Freight wants you to choose. And when you feel like you've won that negotiation, the system behind it has already won long ago. But for those choices to always exist on the shelves, one condition can never change. Costs must stay as low as possible. That condition is decided at the far end of the supply chain. About 85% of Harbor Freight's products come from factories in China. Not because they lack alternatives, but because nowhere else in the world can simultaneously deliver scale, speed, and costs that low. Harbor Freight's entire low-price model is built on that foundation, like a high-rise standing on a single pillar. The problem is that pillar is no longer as stable as it once was. All it takes is a change in import tariffs, a new round of trade escalation, or a political decision out of Washington for the numbers to collapse. A $9 grinder can't jump to $39 or $45 and still keep customers. When cheap disappears, competitive advantage disappears with it. Harbor Freight understands that risk, and they're not waiting for disaster to strike. Quietly, the chain is trying to loosen its absolute dependence on China. Mexico, Canada, and parts of Southeast Asia are being brought into the supply chain, not to fully replace it, but to spread the risk. Not everything at Harbor Freight is a trap. In a system optimized for low prices, there are still areas where costs are cut in the right places and performance remains intact. The issue isn't whether to buy or not to buy. The issue is what you buy and what you use it for. Start with the simplest items. Pittsburgh hand tools. No flash, no refinement, but they do one important thing. They last longer than expected. Wrenches, sockets, pliers. The steel isn't the best, but it's thick enough, strong enough. The lifetime warranty isn't a moral promise, it's an economic calculation. The failure rate is low enough for Harbor Freight to accept, and for the user, that makes it a rare bargain. Next are the mid-tier power tools, Bauer and Hercules. This is where Harbor Freight tries to prove they don't just sell disposable tools. Performance is sufficient for DIYers, for home garages, for weekend projects. They aren't built to run 8 hours a day, but they also don't collapse after just a few uses. The Icon line is a special case. This isn't a product for the masses, it's a message. Build quality approaching Snap-on, but priced low enough to be irritating. Icon doesn't exist to replace major brands in professional garages. It exists to break the assumption that expensive always means better. Then there's Predator, generators. One of the few Harbor Freight products acknowledged by both professional and semi-professional users. When the power goes out, no one cares about the logo. They only care whether the machine starts. And Predator usually does, at roughly half the price. Daytona, the floor jack line, is the final example of smart copying. Familiar design, familiar feel, and a price low enough to be hard to ignore. It's no accident that it became one of the best-selling items. And, finally, consumables, gloves, tarps, zip ties, adhesives, no expectations, no risk. This is Harbor Freight at its purest, selling cheap items so you don't have to think. And next are the items you shouldn't buy, the ones that carry risks the price will never fully reflect. Start with the cheapest power tool line, Warrior. They exist to target one very specific mindset, single use. Weak output, motors that overheat quickly, almost no durability. For tasks that require torque or sustained load, Warrior doesn't fail slowly. It collapses suddenly. And when a tool stops mid-job, the cost is no longer the item itself, but the wasted time and effort. Next are cutting tools, machetes, chisels, lathe bits, soft steel, poor edge retention, quick dulling, easy chipping. This isn't just a performance issue. Low-quality cutting tools force users to apply more force, and that's when accidents happen. The blade doesn't cut, it slips. And when it slips, consequences arrive faster than you expect. But the real danger line is precision measuring tools. Torque wrenches, gauges, alignment tools. With loose QC, error is no longer a minor detail. One wrong number can trigger an entire chain of failures. Bolts over-tightened, components deformed. Damage accumulates silently until everything collapses. And finally, the category you should never economize on: safety equipment. Jacks, jack stands, supports. Here, cheap isn't just risky, cheap is dangerous. When a load-bearing device cuts material quality or loosens QC, the safety margin disappears. No warning, no second chance, just weight coming down. Harbor Freight doesn't hide this. Their model assumes consumers will take responsibility for their own choices. But in a garage, under a car, that responsibility can become an irreversible price. Harbor Freight isn't a market accident. They are a product perfectly optimized for it, an ecosystem born in a time when Americans are forced to live frugally, where good enough replaces long-term, and where tools are no longer symbols of a profession but disposable objects. Harbor Freight didn't create that decline. They simply learned how to profit from it faster and more efficiently than anyone else. Within this system, there are items truly worth buying. And there are items that shouldn't exist in anyone's garage. The difference isn't the price. It's whether you understand the limits of the tool and the limits of yourself. Harbor Freight doesn't deceive its customers. They assume consumers will take responsibility for their choices. But in an increasingly harsh economy, that choice is sometimes no longer freedom, but necessity. Now it's your turn. Have you ever bought something at Harbor Freight that surprised you by how durable it was? Or disappointed you by how bad it turned out? Leave your experience in the comments. Those stories are the real data. If this video helped you avoid a bad decision, hit like and subscribe to the channel. And no matter how cheap you buy, remember one thing: never save money on anything related to workplace safety, because that's a price no one should ever have to pay. See you next time.